Your father would want us to use this money wisely, together. My wife Maggie whispered this to me at his funeral, squeezing my hand while I cried over the man who'd spent 30 years building a $340,000 legacy for his only son. She was so supportive during those dark months, so loving and present, helping me sort through his belongings and talking about keeping his lakefront cabin for our future children. I had no idea that while she held me through grief, she was already planning how to transfer that inheritance to her ex-boyfriend's cryptocurrency scheme and forge my signature to sell the one property that still smelled like my father's coffee. She had no clue that page 17 of Dad's will contained language that would turn her sympathy performance into criminal evidence and her secret affair into a federal case. What happened when I finally pulled out that document will make you check every legal paper you've ever signed. Viewers, has anyone ever used your grief against you? How did you recover? Before we continue, please subscribe, like and share. My name is Recky Mart, and I'm 34 years old, living in Portland, Oregon, where the rain feels like a constant companion and the bridges I design carry thousands of people to destinations I'll never know. I'm a civil engineer, the kind of guy who calculates load-bearing capacities and stress fractures for a living, who finds comfort in numbers that don't lie and structures that hold when everything else crumbles. I met Maggie at a barbecue 7 years ago when I was 25 and stupid enough to believe that lightning strike attraction meant forever. She had this laugh that made you forget your own name, this way of tilting her head when she listened that made you feel like the most important person alive. We married 18 months later in a small ceremony by the Willamette River, her in a simple white dress, me in a suit I'd borrowed from my father. No kids yet, though we'd talked about it endlessly, her always saying the timing wasn't quite right, always one more year, one more promotion, one more something I couldn't quite pin down. Looking back now, standing in the wreckage of what I thought was my life, I realized the cracks were always there, hairline fractures in the foundation I was too blind to see, too trusting to measure, too in love to reinforce before everything collapsed. My father died 14 months ago on a Tuesday morning in March, his heart giving out quietly in his sleep like he'd simply decided he was finished with the world and its disappointments. He was a regional manager for a logistics company, the kind of man who wore the same watch for 30 years and ironed his shirts on Sunday nights, who saved every penny and invested with the caution of someone who'd survived the recession and never forgotten the taste of fear. When the lawyer called me into his office 8 weeks after the funeral, I was still wearing Dad's cologne on my collar just to remember what it felt like when he hugged me. The estate was worth $340,000, cash and stocks and a small lakefront cabin in northern Washington that smelled like pine and old coffee and Sunday mornings. I sat in that lawyer's office staring at numbers that didn't feel real, thinking about how Dad had worked 60-hour weeks for 3 decades to build this, how he'd died 2 months before his planned retirement, how he'd never gotten to enjoy a single day of the freedom he'd earned. Maggie held my hand through all of it, whispering that we'd honor his memory, that we'd keep the cabin for our future children, that we were a team. I believed every word. The money hit our joint account last April, and I remember staring at the balance on my phone like it was written in a foreign language, $340,000 minus estate taxes and probate fees, still enough to change everything. Maggie suggested we pay off her student loans first, $60,000 of debt from a communications degree she'd never really used, then fix the foundation issues in our house that made the floors slope just enough to notice when you dropped a marble. I agreed to everything because that's what you do when you love someone, when you trust them with the parts of yourself that are too broken to show anyone else. 2 weeks later I noticed the first transfer, $15,000 moved to an account I didn't recognize, just a string of numbers on the statement that made my stomach twist. When I asked her about it over dinner, chicken piccata that suddenly tasted like sand in my mouth, she smiled and said she'd opened a new savings account with a higher interest rate, something aggressive to make our money work harder. She kissed my forehead and called me her worrier, her sweet paranoid husband who checked the locks twice before bed. I believed her because I wanted to, because questioning your wife feels like admitting your marriage is already broken, because I was a coward. 3 weeks ago I was sitting at my desk reviewing structural calculations for a bridge retrofit in southeast Portland when my phone rang, unknown number flashing across the screen like a warning I was too distracted to heed. I almost sent it to voicemail, but something made me answer, some instinct I didn't know I possessed until it was too late to matter. The woman's voice was professional and slightly confused, introducing herself as Linda Kowalski from Pacific Trust Real Estate, calling about the property sale that had finalized yesterday, needing my signature on final disclosure documents. I felt my throat close, felt the office walls tilt at angles that defied the engineering principles I'd spent a decade studying. "What property sale?" I managed to ask, my voice sounding distant and hollow like it was coming from underwater. "The cabin in Crescent Lake," she said, papers rustling on her end, "sold for $285,000, closed yesterday. My wife handled most of the paperwork, but they needed both signatures for the final transfer." "Didn't she tell you?" Linda asked, her tone shifting from professional to concerned. I hung up without answering, sat there staring at my computer screen where stress calculations blurred into meaningless numbers, thinking about my father's cabin where he'd taught me to fish and skip stones and believe that good men finish first if they just work hard enough. I drove home in silence, rehearsing conversations I'd never have, practicing calmness I didn't feel, my hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles went white and bloodless. Maggie was in the kitchen making dinner when I walked in, wearing my old college sweatshirt and humming something I didn't recognize, her hair in that messy bun that used to make my heart skip. "I got a call today," I said slowly, watching her face like a scientist observing an experiment, "from a real estate agent named Linda Kowalski about the cabin, about the sale that closed yesterday." Her smile didn't slip immediately, but I saw something flicker behind her eyes, something calculating and cold that I'd never noticed before or maybe had chosen not to see. She set down the knife and turned to face me, already forming words I didn't want to hear, already building lies I was finished believing. "I sold my father's cabin," I said flatly, "the one we agreed to keep for our children, sold it without telling me." She started crying instantly, tears that came too easily and too perfectly, saying she was going to tell me, the timing was never right, we needed the money. "We have money," I said, voice rising, "we have over $300,000. "Not anymore," she whispered, and the world tilted sideways off its axis. She told me about the investments, about meeting a financial advisor named Bradley Chen at some women's networking event, about incredible returns and smart strategies and portfolios that looked legitimate until they weren't. She'd lost $180,000, she said, crying harder now, mascara running down her face in black rivers that reminded me of the Willamette after heavy rain. When the losses became impossible to hide, she'd panicked and sold the cabin to cover the gap, to get us back to even before I noticed, before I could be disappointed in her failures. I stood there watching her perform and realized I was seeing my wife clearly for the first time in 7 years, really seeing her without the filter of love and trust and willful ignorance. "Show me the bank statements," I said quietly, and something in my tone made her stop crying immediately. We sat at the dining room table for 3 hours that night, papers spreading between us like evidence at a crime scene, and with each page I felt something inside me calcify and harden into something sharp enough to cut. There was no Bradley Chen, no legitimate investment account, just regular transfers to someone named Joel Turner, 5,000 here, 8,000 there, building to 25,000, then 40, then a final transfer of 65,000 2 weeks before the cabin sold. Joel Turner was her college boyfriend, the one she'd called ancient history when we first started dating, who supposedly lived in Denver working in tech and meant absolutely nothing to her anymore. The statements told a different story, a narrative of deliberate deception that made my chest feel hollow and cavernous. She tried to explain it away, calling them loans, talking about his startup idea and cryptocurrency mining infrastructure and projections that looked real enough to believe. "Did you sign anything?" I asked, "any contracts or promissory notes, anything that makes this legitimate?" The silence that followed told me everything. She'd just sent him money, hundreds of thousands of dollars of my father's inheritance to fund her ex-boyfriend's fantasies, and when I called it what it was, when I said the word stealing out loud, she finally dropped the act. "It wasn't stealing," she said, voice turning cold and unfamiliar, "it was our money, and besides I wouldn't understand because I never take risks, I'm too busy playing it safe and being the dependable boring guy while Joel understood ambition." She gestured around our home like it was a prison, like everything I'd built was somehow insufficient, somehow less than whatever fantasy she'd constructed with a man who'd conned her out of $500,000 and disappeared. That night after she left, staying with her sister, or maybe that was another lie, I couldn't sleep or eat or do anything except sit in my home office at 3 in the morning reading estate documents I'd been too grief-stricken to fully absorb when Dad died. Page 17 of the will contained a protection provision, language designating the inheritance as separate property not subject to community property laws or marital claims, probably because Dad never trusted Maggie even when I defended her at every Sunday dinner. Every dollar was legally mine alone, which meant every transfer she'd made constituted theft, conversion of separate property, grounds for criminal prosecution and civil recovery. I sat there holding that document, feeling something shift inside me, grief transforming into purpose, pain crystallizing into clarity. I called 3 people that morning: my father's estate attorney, a forensic accountant, and a lawyer who specialized in cases exactly like mine. The forensic accountant found the signature forgery 2 days later, Maggie's clumsy attempt to digitally place my signature on cabin sale documents, obvious once you knew to look. I had her completely, had evidence that would destroy her in court or send her to prison, had power I'd never wanted and wouldn't hesitate to use because she'd stolen more than money, she'd stolen my father's legacy and my faith in human decency. 2 weeks later we sat across from each other in my attorney's conference room, Maggie with her own lawyer who looked uncomfortable the moment he saw our documentation. My attorney Patricia Reeves slid a folder across the table containing the will provision, bank records showing $468,000 in unauthorized transfers, text messages between Maggie and Joel discussing their investment in what Reki doesn't know, and Linda Kowalski's notarized statement about the forged signatures. "This is theft, forgery, and fraud," Patricia said calmly. "Criminal exposure is substantial, but we're willing to resolve this civilly with full restitution secured by liens against all of Mrs. Mart's assets, divorce with no alimony either direction, and 72 hours to accept before we proceed with prosecution." Maggie cried real tears this time, asking where she was supposed to get $468,000, and I told her that wasn't my concern, maybe Joel could help. "He doesn't have it," she whispered, "the business failed, it's all gone." "Then you'll be paying it back for the rest of your life," I said, "every dollar with interest, or you can go to prison, your choice." She signed the agreement 3 days later, $1,200 a month garnished from her paycheck for the next 32 years, until she's 65 and I'm 66. The divorce finalized last month, 7 years erased in a signature, and Joel Turner got 5 to 7 years for wire fraud after the FBI discovered Maggie wasn't his only victim. We recovered $78,000 from auctioning his seized assets, his car and equipment, and the remnants of his fraudulent lifestyle. Maggie sends her payments every month like clockwork, $1,200 that will take 3 decades to satisfy, and I bought a small cabin in northern Idaho that's mine alone, closing in 30 days. Last week I received a letter at my office, hand-addressed from Seattle, Maggie's handwriting confessing that she and Joel never stopped seeing each other, that the loan started 3 years before my father died, that they'd planned to take everything and start over in Denver until he ghosted her and left her with nothing. She wrote that she never loved me the way I deserved, that my father's death was convenient timing, that it was always a choice not a mistake. I read that letter sitting on a dock by a public lake watching the sunset, thinking about how she stole 7 years I can never recover, how she's trapped in debt until retirement while I get to walk away and rebuild. The forensic accountant found evidence of other victims, women Joel scammed the same way, a possible class action suit that might recover more of the inheritance or might not. Either way, I'm not waiting. I'm 34 and healthy and employed and free, building a life she can never touch, learning that trust is earned and documents matter, and sometimes the best revenge is simply surviving while they drown in consequences they created. And somewhere in Denver a detective found photographs in Joel's apartment dating back 6 years, pictures of Maggie and me and my father. A ledger with other names suggesting we were part of something bigger, but that's another story. For another time, and right now all I want is to watch this sunset and feel nothing except the weight of documents that saved me and the knowledge that I'm finally, completely, done. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and share.